It was the 1970s, and a serial killer walked the streets of New York City for more than a year, terrorizing everyone, especially women, until this man was captured, putting an end to it all, but leaving many with the question, why?
Some criminals are so ruthless, so beyond redemption, that even a prison cell seems too good for them. I've always been fascinated by cases like this, where the crimes go beyond what you'd expect from even the worst offenders. I dug into the stories of people whose actions were so heinous, so chilling, that they made you wonder if a simple prison sentence was really enough to hold them accountable. What I found was shocking. These are people whose evil deeds are so crazy that even the justice system seemed to struggle with what to do with them. Because when you look at these individuals, you realize that prison might just be too mild a punishment for the things they did.
Tell me in a sentence who you are.
Starting with John Wayne Gacy. John Wayne Gacy is one of those names that just gives you chills the second you hear it. On the surface, he was the type of guy you'd never expect to be capable of anything sinister. The guy ran a successful construction business, was active in local politics, and was even the friendly neighborhood clown at kids' parties. That's right, he performed as Pogo the Clown, making balloon animals and entertaining children.
Fun being a clown because you could be yourself or just let yourself go and act a fool. You could be slapstick and funny and have a good time. That's why I always enjoyed clowning. Clowning has taken a bad name because of what they've used in my case.
Gacy seemed like a regular, charming guy, but underneath it all, he was a monster. Between 1972 and 1978, Gacy was responsible for the murders of at least 33 young men and boys, and he got away with it for years because he was so good at playing the part of the nice guy.
At house of his on Summerdale, a crime of horrendous proportions. In the crawl space underneath, bodies covered with lime and encased in plastic, dug up a few days before Christmas and carried into the December cold, one after another. He was approachable, helpful, and seemingly harmless. He'd offer jobs to teenagers or invite them over for a drink, and they'd go. And that's when everything took a turn. Once they were in his house, they were trapped. One of Gacy's sick tricks was something he called the handcuff trick. He'd pretend to show his victims a magic trick, basically. He'd offer to handcuff them, and then once they were locked in place, he'd say, "The trick is, you have to get out." Well, no one ever got out. He would torture them, strangle them, and then bury them beneath his house. And if that wasn't horrifying enough, he did this over and over again, storing the bodies in the crawl space where they would stay hidden for years. The fact that Gacy could get away with these crimes for so long is almost mind-boggling. He was well liked by his neighbors, known in his community, and police had no reason to suspect him. He even had a reputation for helping out in local charity events and playing the role of a stand-up guy. Who would suspect the friendly neighborhood clown, right? But in 1978, everything changed when a 15-year-old boy named Robert Peast went missing. Peast had been last seen leaving his job at a pharmacy, and his final destination was Gacy's house. Once Robert's disappearance was linked to Gacy, police began looking into him. Gacy tried to keep up his normal act, but it was clear he was starting to slip. He was nervous, acting strange, and even leaving behind some bizarre clues that raised suspicion. Eventually, the cops got a warrant and searched his house. What they found in that crawl space, it was beyond anything anyone could have imagined. Gacy had buried 29 bodies beneath his home, and there were even more found in nearby rivers. It was a complete nightmare. Gacy tried to pull the insanity card, claiming that the murders were out of his control, but the jury wasn't buying it. Less than 2 hours later, he was convicted and sentenced to death. Gacy spent years on death row, but in 1994, he was finally executed. His last words, "Kiss my ass." Yeah, that's how cold he was. Even though he's gone now, Gacy's story is still one of the most disturbing in American history. His ability to seem like just another guy, someone you'd wave to as you walked past, makes his crimes even scarier. He was a master of deception, and that's what makes him such a terrifying figure. We can watch documentaries.
I could put on clown makeup and I was relaxed. And I enjoyed doing it. It was It was only twice a month that I did it.
Read books and obsess over every detail of his case. But the fact remains, he got away with it for years, all while hiding behind the mask of a normal, friendly guy. Kind of like Jeffrey Dahmer was one of the most disturbing criminals in history. Between 1978 and 1991, he murdered 17 men in ways that were beyond horrifying. The worst part is that he didn't just kill them. He kept body parts, committed acts of necrophilia, and even ate some of his victims. That's how he got the nickname the Milwaukee Cannibal. Dahmer had a pattern. He'd lure men back to his apartment, usually by offering them money for photos or just promising a good time. Once they were inside, he'd drug them so they couldn't fight back. What happened next was pure nightmare fuel: strangulation, dismemberment, and worse. He even tried to create zombies by drilling holes in some victims' skulls and pouring acid inside, hoping to keep them alive but completely under his control. It never worked, but that didn't stop him from trying. For years, he somehow managed to keep getting away with it, even when people got suspicious. Like when a 14-year-old boy was found wandering the streets drugged and naked, police actually returned the kid to Dahmer, who claimed they were just having a lover's spat. That boy was murdered shortly after. Everything finally fell apart in 1991 when one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, escaped and ran straight to the police. When officers entered Dahmer's apartment, they walked into something straight out of a horror movie: severed heads in the fridge, human remains everywhere, and photos of dismembered bodies. The case was closed right then and there. At trial, Dahmer admitted everything. He didn't even try to deny it. He was sentenced to 16 life terms, which basically meant he was never getting out. But prison didn't last long for him. In 1994, another inmate beat him to death with a metal bar. Just like that, Jeffrey Dahmer was gone. Even after his death, people are still fascinated and horrified by what he did. Countless documentaries, books, and shows have tried to unpack how he got away with it for so long. Netflix even made a series about him, reminding everyone just how terrifying his story really was. Almost as terrifying as Aileen Wuornos. She is one of the most infamous female serial killers in American history, but her story is more complicated than most. Between 1989 and 1990, she killed 7 men in Florida, all of whom she met while working as a prostitute. But unlike most serial killers, she didn't just murder for the thrill. She claimed she was acting in self-defense. Wuornos had a rough life from the start. She grew up in an abusive home, left at a young age, and ended up living on the streets. She survived by hitchhiking and doing sex work, which is how she met the men she would later kill. She said they had assaulted or tried to harm her, so she shot them before they could hurt her. The courts, however, didn't buy the self-defense argument. Her downfall came in 1991 when she was arrested at a biker bar in Florida. The cops had already connected her to the murders, but what really sealed her fate was her girlfriend, Tyria Moore. The police pressured Moore into getting Wuornos to confess on tape, and it worked. Aileen admitted to everything. Her trial was a media circus. The prosecution painted her as a cold-blooded killer, while she insisted she had only killed to protect herself. In the end, it didn't matter. She was convicted and sentenced to death. She spent over a decade on death row before being executed by lethal injection in 2002. Even after her death, people are still debating her case. Was she a heartless killer, or was she a victim who snapped after a lifetime of abuse? The same thing that might explain what happened with Richard Ramirez, better known as the Night Stalker, was one of the scariest serial killers to ever walk the streets. In the mid-1980s, this guy had all of Southern California absolutely losing it. He went after men, women, kids, the elderly, whoever happened to be home when he broke in. That's what made him so terrifying. There was no pattern, no logic, just pure chaos. The dude was obsessed with Satanism too. He'd leave pentagrams at crime scenes and even told some victims to swear to Satan before attacking them. He didn't stick to one method of killing either. Sometimes he'd use a gun, sometimes a knife, sometimes a hammer. It was like he just picked whatever was lying around. People were terrified because he was breaking into homes at random, and no one knew where he'd strike next. For months, the police were struggling to pin him down. They had his footprints, they had a vague description, but Ramirez seemed to vanish after every attack. The whole city was freaking out. People were double locking their doors, sleeping with weapons next to their beds. If you lived in LA at the time, you were looking over your shoulder constantly. Then, the guy made a huge mistake. He got sloppy. Police finally got a good look at him and released his mugshot. Turns out, Ramirez didn't watch the news because the very next day, he strolled into a convenience store like he wasn't the most wanted man in California. Someone recognized him and word spread fast. Within minutes, he was being chased down the street by an angry mob. These people were not messing around. They literally caught him, beat the hell out of him, and held him down until the cops showed up. At his trial, Ramirez was as creepy as ever. He flashed a pentagram on his palm, grinned at the cameras, and acted like he was some kind of rock star. Even weirder, he had groupies, women who were obsessed with him, and wrote him love letters. He got sentenced to death, but California being California, he never made it to the execution chamber. He spent years on death row before dying of cancer in 2013. David Berkowitz, better known as the Son of Sam, was a guy who seriously shook up New York City in the late 70s. He wasn't like your usual serial killer. This man made headlines not just for the murders, but for the absolutely bizarre reason he gave for committing them. Between 1976 and 1977, Berkowitz killed 6 people and injured 7 others. His victims were usually young couples, shot while sitting in their cars or just hanging out. The city was on edge, not knowing where he'd strike next or if they might be his next target. People started locking their doors and staying in at night, afraid to be out after dark. What really set Berkowitz apart was his story. When he was arrested in 1977, he confessed, but he didn't exactly give a normal reason for his killing spree. Instead, he claimed he was being ordered to do it by a demon that had taken over his neighbor's dog. Yep, you read that right. According to Berkowitz, the dog was possessed, and it was the dog that told him who to kill. Obviously, no one believed this at first. How could they? It sounded completely out there. But according to Berkowitz, that's what was happening, and he stuck to that story. Once they tracked him down, it didn't take long for Berkowitz to confess. He didn't seem to care about hiding his actions or trying to play it cool. He admitted to everything, and soon, the whole city was relieved to know the person behind the killings was off the streets. In 1977, Berkowitz was convicted, and instead of the death penalty, he got life in prison. He's still there to this day, serving his sentence, although in later years, he started trying to find redemption, claiming he had found God and wasn't the same person anymore. Some say that everyone deserves a second chance, and that the world should just let it go, but people like this next one don't get one. No questions asked. Dennis Rader, this is the guy behind the BTK Killer nickname, which stands for bind, torture, kill. This guy was an absolute nightmare. He was active in Kansas from 1974 to 1991, and he murdered 10 people during that time. But what made him stand out from the rest of the serial killers is that he was taunting the police and the media with letters, bragging about his crimes. Imagine that, just writing to the press like, "Hey, I did this, and here's how," almost daring them to catch him. For years, he went completely unnoticed, even though he was sending these creepy letters. It's almost like he was playing a twisted game of hide and seek. The craziest part? After a while, he just stopped. No one knew if he'd retired or if he was still out there. It was like he disappeared into thin air. But then, in 2004, he came back. Yep, after all that time, he started sending letters again. And this is where he really messed up. He sent a floppy disk, like an old school one, that ended up being his downfall. Seriously, a floppy disk. It was tracked back to him, and that was it. The police finally had enough to arrest him in 2005, and at first, he tried to deny it, but he didn't hold out for long. He confessed to all 10 murders. What's wild is that Rader wasn't some creepy loner living under a bridge. Oh no, he was a normal guy. He had a family, he went to church, he worked as a compliance officer. It's insane how someone like that could be living a completely double life, right? To everyone around him, he was just another regular guy. But when they dug deeper into his past, they found out that he was living this whole secret life as a killer. His case got a lot of attention, especially in true crime crime documentaries like Most Evil. They try to break down what makes someone like him tick. It's fascinating in a terrifying way. He was the kind of guy who blended in so well with society. It was almost like you'd never know the truth about him until it was too late. It's one of those stories that sticks with you, not just because of the gruesome details, but because he seemed like he could be anyone. But at least he let the victims kinda rest in peace. Ed Gein turned his victims into DIY supplies. This guy wasn't really a traditional serial killer in the sense that he didn't rack up a huge body count, but his crimes were so messed up that he basically inspired a whole bunch of horror movie characters we know today. Think Norman Bates from Psycho, Leatherface from Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and even Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs. Yeah, all of those creepy characters had a little bit of Gein in them. So here's the deal. Gein was active in the 1950s, and he was living out in Wisconsin. He didn't kill a ton of people, but the two women he did murder were part of his sick and twisted obsession. But that's not even the worst part. What makes his crimes so disturbing is what he did after the murders. Gein wasn't just about killing. He went a whole extra step by exhuming dead bodies from graves and using the body parts. Yeah, that's right. He made furniture, clothing, and even some pretty insane trophies from human skin and bones. Imagine that. This guy had a collection of body parts he'd used to create these bizarre, macabre pieces of art. It's like something straight out of a horror film. Gein's downfall came in 1957 when a woman went missing, and all signs pointed to him. When police went to his house, they were greeted with a scene straight out of a nightmare. They found all kinds of creepy stuff: human skin lampshades, a skull bowl, and all sorts of body part decorations. It didn't take long for them to arrest him. When they did, Gein was declared insane and sent to a mental institution for the rest of his life. He never saw the outside world again, and he died there in 1984. But his legacy lived on in pop culture. Like I said, characters like Norman Bates and Leatherface were inspired by him. And if you want to dive deeper into his twisted story, there are documentaries like Ed Gein, The Real Leatherface, that go into the details of his life. Of course, there are also the countless horror films that borrow from his real-life crimes. He's one of those figures that reminds you how truth can sometimes be scarier than fiction. Next up is the story of Jack Unterweger. This guy was an Austrian serial killer whose life took some seriously wild turns. So, Jack was initially convicted of murder back in 1974 when he killed a woman. He was sentenced to life in prison. But here's the twist. He convinced the authorities he had been rehabilitated. He got out in 1990, which is kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. Like, how do you go from being a convicted murderer to being free? But they let him out, thinking he had turned his life around. But once Jack was out, he didn't exactly make the most of his second chance. Instead of starting fresh, he went back to his old ways, big time. He began a new killing spree, and this time he targeted sex workers across Austria, Germany, and even the US. His method was disturbing. He strangled his victims using their own bras. It's a brutal and chilling detail that shows how twisted this guy really was. He was an incredibly calculated killer, and even though authorities were on high alert, he managed to slip through the cracks for a while. Jack's killing spree was going on for a couple of years, and it was clear he wasn't going to stop anytime soon. What made it worse was the fact that he seemed to have this weird confidence, like he knew he could get away with it. He wasn't even hiding. He was in plain sight. He had this bizarre charm, and charm seemed to be a part of his appeal, because before his true identity came out, he even became somewhat of a celebrity in Austria. He wrote books, got interviews, and even appeared on TV, somehow fooling everyone into thinking he was this reformed man. But eventually, Jack's luck ran out. In 1992, after a huge international manhunt, he was finally caught. It was pretty dramatic, with police tracking him down across borders. They pieced together the truth, and his dark past caught up with him. They arrested him, and he went to trial, where the full extent of his crimes came to light. Here's where things take a tragic and almost poetic turn. After being convicted, Jack didn't stick around to face his punishment. The same night he was sentenced, he took his own life in his prison cell. He hanged himself just hours after after his conviction. It was the kind of ending that was almost too dark to be real, but it was. Jack's story remains a reminder of how dangerous it can be when the system gets it wrong, letting someone like him back into society. Charles Manson, one of the most notorious criminals in American history, and his story is as bizarre as it gets. Manson came to fame in the late 1960s, but not for any good reason. He was the leader of a cult-like group called the Manson family. This group were a bunch of deeply disturbed followers led by Manson, who convinced them to carry out some of the most shocking murders in modern history. So, Manson himself was an ex-con, and he had a strange, magnetic personality. He didn't have any formal power, but he somehow managed to convince a group of mostly young, impressionable people to follow him and believe in his bizarre worldview. He played off their need for a sense of purpose, and he made himself out to be some kind of spiritual leader. He'd talk about the apocalypse and how it was coming soon, convincing his followers that they needed to prepare for it by killing. Yeah, things were about to get really dark. The turning point came in August 1969, when Manson and his followers went on a killing spree that shocked the world. They murdered 7 people in a series of brutal, bloody attacks. The most infamous of these murders was the killing of actress Sharon Tate, who was 8 months pregnant at the time, along with 4 others who were at her home. Tate's murder was just the beginning, though. The murders were carried out with a level of violence and randomness that left the world stunned. Manson's followers, who were completely under his spell, carried out these murders with a complete lack of remorse. In fact, they believed they were helping Manson bring about a race war he called Helter Skelter, a term he took from the Beatles' song of the same name, twisting its meaning to fit his warped narrative. They believed that the murders would incite chaos and spark a revolution. Spoiler alert, it didn't work out quite how Manson thought it would. Eventually, the Manson family was caught. In 1971, Manson and several of his followers were arrested and charged with the murders. During his trial, Manson showed no remorse and acted like a total spectacle, playing into the idea that he was some kind of cult leader. In the end, he was convicted of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Manson was sentenced to death, but his sentence was later commuted to life in prison after California abolished the death penalty. He spent the rest of his life behind bars, becoming more of a media figure than he probably ever imagined. He died in 2017 at the age of 83. Which one of these do you find the most shocking?